Shalom and welcome to a special edition of the Middle East Report as we mark the International Holocaust Memorial Day. And today we have a real special guest, Holocaust survivor. Her name is Mala Tribich. And you've got a powerful and compelling story to tell. So I want to welcome you firstly to the Middle East Report, and it's a great honor and a privilege to host you and have you on the program today, Mala.
Thank you.
Mala, you were born in Poland in 1930. Can you share with our viewers something about Jewish family life, something about your family background from Poland in the 1930s?
Well, I was one of three children, the middle one, with an older brother, Ben, and a younger sister, Lucia. And before the war, my life was very happy, quite unremarkable, the life of that period. I went to school, I had friends, they came to tea, I went there, all the usual things. We were a moderately observant Jewish family. My father owned a flour mill, actually it was in partnership with his brother and another man. The life was unremarkable, but very happy, with lots of cousins and aunts and uncles. Three lived in our hometown, Piotrków, but lots of them were sort of all around that part of Poland, and we did see one another often, and it was a very happy pre-war life.
And growing up as a child, did you experience any anti-Semitism yourself?
I did. I didn't experience it to a great extent because we lived in an area which was mixed. There were Jews and Christians, and so obviously some of them were friends. Some of them were a bit hostile and anti-Semitic. And I'm just speaking from my point of view as a girl of 8 before the war started. And I personally didn't experience it to a great extent, but I was very aware that there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And of course, especially, but I've learned this since, that some of it was actually came from it was government instituted, so that it was official when there were quotas for Jews, or they were not allowed to certain places. So I wasn't quite aware of it then, but I did hear the usual sort of calls, calling Jews all sorts of things, yeah.
Yeah, and were your parents aware, or did they tell you about the rise of Nazism and the rise of Hitler, both in Germany and Austria, and in the kind of maybe the months building up to the start of the Nazi invasion of Poland, which was the 1st of September 1939? Was there a growing sense that maybe the Jewish community was under threat at that time?
I'm sure that my parents were well aware. But I can't say that I was. I was a little bit aware because I remember meeting people who had come from Germany. They were sort of turning up. Some of them had brought various possessions that they tried to sell to get some money. And I remember someone wanting to sell my mother a beautiful doll, because the Germans were actually well known for beautiful things for children, toys. So I was slightly aware, but not very much, because I think in any case the adults would have tried to preserve their children from knowing too much of what was so terrible.
No, of course. And can you describe for us what your parents were like? From what I've read, with interviews we've done, particularly from the Holocaust Educational Trust and their website, it seems that you had very loving and very caring parents. Can you say what your parents were like?
Yes, well, my mother was very different from my father. My father was quite easygoing. My mother was strict. And my father was quite well known for his sporting sort of desire. He used to ride horses, swim. He's known to have gone swimming in the frozen lake in the middle of winter, break the ice. And he was very friendly, very, very charitable as well. He was very generous to charities. And he was very much liked. And in fact, I remember someone saying, that was during the war already, that if anybody will survive this war, Mr. Helfgott will, because he was the sort of person that could manage somehow to get this extra food for us in the ghetto, and he had lots of contacts outside. He was not afraid of things. He was facing dangers, and this actually is what cost him his life in the end.
Wow.
But we'll come to that later, of course.
Yes, of course. Now, what were your first memories of the Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939?
Well, the actual memory that I have of the outbreak of war is that there was some sort of commotion, and we went out into the street, and I remember seeing broken glass, the broken bottle, and that was the only thing I know at the beginning. Then also the bombing started. After that, we were taking shelter in the basement of a neighbor. We lived in a block of flats, and somewhere along there was sort of semi-basement, and we went there during the bombing. The bombing was quite severe, and it lasted a little while, because we were actually on the western side of Poland, which was sort of nearer Germany, near the border. And my parents actually decided to leave and try and go east, but we didn't get very far. We only got about 15 miles from home when we met up in a town called Soleil. We met up with my uncle, my father's brother, and they had and of course that town where we were taking shelter, thinking we were safe there, it was actually very heavily bombed, and we're lucky to survive that bombing. And we decided to return home because the Germans were catching up with us, and there was nowhere to run, really.
And was there a sense of fear during this occasion? Because obviously your parents would have been well known about the how horrific and how anti-Semitic the Nazis were.
Yes, but it was a war, so there was fear, obviously, of the war, but none of us could have imagined what was to come. I mean, this was the unimaginable, that it'll end in so many deaths and in concentration camps and gassing and all the terrible things. We certainly didn't foresee that.
What happened when the Nazis caught up with you and your family?
Well, once they invaded our town, at first it was all a little bit haphazard. We saw the soldiers in the street, and they weren't unfriendly. There was nothing terrible, but within 2 months of the war, we were forced out of our homes into a ghetto. Ours was the first town in Poland to have a ghetto. So by the 1st of November 1939, we were already incarcerated in a ghetto. And once we were in there, things got really bad. And all the time we thought, well, it can't get worse than that. It will soon get better. The war will soon be over. We're very optimistic. But little did we know that it was to last for 5.5 years, and that so many people, so much loss of life and all the terrible tragedies that befell people.
And Mala, can you describe what the ghetto was like? What were conditions like in the ghetto?
Well, it was very overcrowded. There were 15,000 Jews in Piotrków, in my hometown, but at its height, the ghetto had 28,000. Because the people from around this place between the German border and our town, all along the border, was immediately annexed. It became part of Germany, and of course had to be made what they called Judenreich, free of Jews. So all these people, all the Jews were either deported to our ghetto, or some of them found their way there because they knew people. And it became terribly overcrowded. The overcrowding was such that there could be as many as 10 people to a room, or 3 families to a room. We were subjected to all sorts of indignities and beating and rounding up of people. They did create a Jewish administration, but that's such a big subject that I won't sort of start on that. It was very scary for a young girl. I was, by then in November, I had just turned 9 at the end of September, and school stopped for Jewish children. And there were constant roundups. People were being deported and people were being killed. And of course, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. Some people managed to get a little extra. My father did because he had friends outside, but that was always at the risk of one's life if one did get out. People over the age of 12 had to wear an armband on the forearm, a white armband with a blue Star of David, but only people over 12, so that didn't apply to me. So if I were to go outside the ghetto and I wasn't spotted, I could possibly get away with it. I did on 1 or 2 occasions. But it was all very dangerous. We were at the mercy of the occupiers, Germans, who were doing just whatever they wanted with us. And well, what they were doing was just dreadful.
Yeah, absolutely horrific. Now, your parents, your very loving parents, decided that it probably wasn't safe for you to stay in the ghetto, so they put you with a Christian family in Poland. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, well, they only did that at a certain point, about 2.5 years into the war, because there was going to be a deportation, and everybody except people with work permits were going to be deported. And we knew what that meant because we knew about the camps, the annihilation camps, the Treblinka and Sobibor. We knew that the camps that people were sent to there, the people never came out. And some people tried to save themselves before the deportation started. And there were ways and means, like, for instance, some people managed to smuggle themselves out of the ghetto, and they had either some friends outside who would help, or they would live in the open or in the sewers or anywhere to avoid deportation. And my parents were recommended to a family in another town called Częstochowa, where they were to take us. Well, I say us, they were willing to hide 2 Jewish girls during the deportations. And they were recommended, it was my aunt and uncle, the Klein family, and they had the one daughter, Ija. We were sort of recommended together so that they would take my cousin Ija and me for the duration of the deportations. And it was very difficult. They said they'd take 1 girl at a time because it would have been too dangerous to have 2 on a journey where there were constant searches, and they used to stop people, look at papers. And what's more, there was actually reward for turning in Jews. And some people made it into quite a lucrative business. So, because they were on the lookout for Jews, we were aware of this, and we're really scared because if anyone looked at us for more than a couple of seconds, we thought they were suspecting us. And it didn't matter that one didn't look Jewish, and that, one fellow had the right papers, there were false papers. But the fact that they were looking for Jews, we were always scared and worried that they'll discover us. But we did get to Częstochowa, one at a time, a week apart, and we found ourselves in a house on the outskirts with a middle-aged couple who weren't exactly thrilled to have us, but they tolerated us. They didn't ill-treat us. But we were very vulnerable, and if I'll give you just one example, we were supposed to be relatives who have come to stay for a little while from Warsaw. And when there was a knock on the door, sometimes it was okay for us to mix. Other times, before they opened the door, they'd get us out of sight, under the bed, into a cupboard, anywhere away from whoever came. But on one occasion, when we were mixing, one of the men, one of the guests, started a conversation with me. And he started by saying, I hear that you are visiting from Warsaw. Where do you live in Warsaw? And I became so paranoid about it that I was so sure that he must be suspecting me. So scared I had forgotten this address, which was a false address, and I didn't really know it, but I did try to memorize it, but at that moment I couldn't think of it. But I did have the sort of mind, the sort of presence of mind to make up an address. And I got away with it. It was okay. And in fact, this man was just being sociable. He didn't suspect anything. But it just shows you that, the situation was such. I mean, we never felt safe. We also felt very homesick. And my cousin Ija was an only child. She couldn't bear being away from her parents, and she really wanted to go back. She was in quite a state about it. And she asked to be taken back, and she was told she can't go yet because the deportations are still happening. And she said that her parents have got very good friends in Piotrków who are hiding her parents' valuables, and they'll take her in. And the man said, okay. And off they went, and I thought how lucky she was to be with her parents, and I was there, I don't know how long, but just seemed like a lifetime. But eventually my time came to go home, and arrangements were made to meet in the flour mill where my father now was a worker. And when we arrived in this right at the top of the building, in a sort of storehouse, a store playroom, very large area, my father was there waiting, but also my uncle, Joseph Klein. And he looked at us, he went white. He said, where's my daughter? And the man said that he brought her back and took her to these friends. He mentioned them, their name. And he said, but she's not there, where is she? What have you done with my child? And I can still remember vividly my uncle pacing up and down with his hands behind his back, looking at the ground, going there and back, saying, what have you done with my child? And that's really the end of the story, because nobody knows what happened to Ija till this day. It was a most terrible tragedy, because my aunt, my uncle was killed soon afterwards by the Germans with some other people. They were rounded up and kept in jail, then they were taken to the to cemetery, and they were all shot. And my aunt actually survived the war. And when we met, we hardly ever talked about each other because neither of us knew very much, but she knew a little more than I did. Because apparently she told me that she turned up, that the men did bring Ija back to these very good friends. He collected a suitcase full of valuables, and he left with Ija and the suitcase. And my aunt said, how could anybody sort of do away with the child? Nobody knows what they did with her, how they got rid of her, but so how could anyone do it for just some goods? I would have given them everything I possessed if only they had saved her. And my aunt lived with these terrible thoughts, and we hardly ever spoke about it because it was too painful. But on one occasion when we did, she said to me, I hesitate to repeat it even, she said, my Ija had to go into the gas chamber by herself. There was nobody to hold her hand. And this is the sort of pain she lived with till the end of her life.
Mala, can you say what happened after you were reunited with your father? And it must have been wonderful to see your father again.
Well, it was wonderful. After but what had happened to Ija, I just couldn't get around my head. I just didn't know what to think. But at that time, when I was reunited with my father, I went back into the ghetto with the Working Party. And the ghetto by then had been reduced from 28,000 people to 2,400 people. And they were all these people, most of them had working permits. Now, when I went back with this Working Party, you would think that it was easy for a little girl by the side of a column of men, grown men with going through. But it wasn't like that, because they were always searching, and they were looking at papers, they were counting. But at that time, they turned a blind eye. They didn't take any notice because they knew that some people had saved themselves during the deportations, and they're now filtering back into the ghetto. And they just let them go through. Well, actually, when we were going through, little did we know, actually, that we were walking into a trap. Because when I got back, there was, the ghetto was then, looked terrible, with very few people, very few families left. There were mostly just people of working age. But I found my mother and sister, Lucia, there. My father by then had a job, but he was also in hiding during the deportation, as was my sister and my mother. But they were much nearer home and in different places, each one in a different, with a different family. My brother Ben had a work permit, so my family was intact, but that was very unusual. Most families had disappeared altogether. Some of them, there may have been 1 or 2 members left. And time went on for a little while. Conditions were much worse than before. The overcrowding was still there, even more so. Whereas before we had a room for our family, now we had a corner of a room. And now, after a little while, they started rounding people up again. They called them the illegals. And they were searching through the ghetto, through the rooms and cellars and lofts and everywhere they could, and taking people to the synagogue, which before the war was a beautiful building. Now it was in a terrible state. They used it as stables. And they were adding people for about a week or two. They were searching for people who were not there legally and who didn't have work permits. And they were being taken to this synagogue and kept there without any food or water or sanitary provisions. And no heating, and that was in the middle of a very, very deep, frost-deep winter. In December, it was, 1942. And on one occasion, they stormed into a room where my mother and sister were, with a lot of other people. They took them all to this place. And the synagogue was guarded by Ukrainian soldiers with their rifles, patrolling all the way around. And they used to shoot through the windows, kill people and injure them. And they were just doing it to amuse themselves. They were bored. After a little while, I don't know the exact time scale, but after about a couple of weeks, maybe a little more or less, they were taken out at dawn in groups of 50 and marched to the local forest called Rakov. And there they were killed in the most horrific way. We know what happened because there were witnesses who came to tell us, but it's something I never repeat. It's all very well documented. And it was actually the type of killing. Well, the first group found their communal grave ready waiting for them, so they knew what was awaiting them. And so the other groups followed. And it was a type of killing that took place around that time. It was 1942, all over Europe in forests. The largest one of it was actually Babi Yar in the Ukraine, which is well known. There's a book called Babi Yar that documents it all. So that's how I lost my mother and sister in these terrible circumstances. Then we know the exact date, which was the 20th of December 1942. After that, there were just the three of us left, my father, Ben, and I. But they were still rounding people up, sometimes even people who had work permits. And on one occasion, they rounded up an aunt of mine on the Helfgott side of the family. Ija was the Klein side on my mother's side. They rounded up my aunt, Irene, and she was taken away screaming, "Who'll look after my child?" She had a 5-year-old daughter, Anne. And by then, I was the only female member of the Helfgott family left, and it was down to me. I was 12. And Ija was 5, and I looked after her. And after that, the ghetto was liquidated altogether, and there were only 2 groups of people who were going to their work places where in the meantime, they had prepared the barracks for them. So before they were transferred, there were still some illegals, because, for instance, I wasn't legal, nor was my little cousin. But there were others as well. And at that time, they emptied the ghetto. There were only the two groups of people. One of them, a lot of them were at work, those that were working. Some of the workers were in the ghetto, and all the few illegals as well. So they rounded up all those, included my cousin and myself. And we were taken outside the ghetto walls, and we were standing in a column ready to be deported. And lorries were coming up and collecting people at the head of the column and taking them away. I was more towards the end, and we were all surrounded by the German soldiers with their rifles at the ready, and it was all terribly scary. There was a woman in front of me who had a baby in her arms, and suddenly she was hit over the head with a rifle butt, and she was bleeding. The baby was screaming, and she was crying. The woman was crying. It was just really horrific, what was going on around us. And the lorries continued to come and take people away. And as I was standing there towards the end of the column, I noticed that there was a German officer who was obviously in charge. And he wasn't doing anything, he was just watching. I mean, he had plenty of people there doing the job. And I don't know what gave me the idea or the courage to do it, but I stepped out of line, and I went up to him very quickly and said that I have been separated from my father and brother. They're inside the ghetto. Could I go back to them? And he was absolutely flabbergasted. He looked slightly amused, slightly sort of curious, and I don't know what was in his mind, but he actually called a policeman over and said, take her back inside the ghetto. And as we were walking along, I said to the policeman, just a minute, I've got to get my cousin. She's just over there. And he said, you can't because she hasn't had permission. So there I was in this situation with this dilemma. What do I do? Do I sort of abandon my cousin, or do I lose the chance of being reunited with my father and brother? And those were the sort of situations, quite apart from the physical suffering, that one had to make decisions. Sometimes they would save your life, and sometimes that you get killed. But my way of dealing with it was simply to keep on arguing with him until eventually he gave up and he said, oh, okay, take her. So we're both back there. And we were both sort of allocated, luckily, to the same place as my father and Ben. But we're no longer together because men and women were always housed separately in those places. So my father and Ben were in the barracks with the men. I was with the women. I started work at the age of 12. I became a slave laborer. And my cousin Anne, who was absolutely paranoid about staying with me, not losing me. Of course, she had to let me go to work. But because we were working shifts and there were always some women in the barracks who would look after her. Well, not look after her, but keep an eye on her. And we were there for about 18 months, a little more than 18 months, and it became, work was very hard and long hours. We were there for about 18 months, a little more than 18 months, when we were deported. We walked to the local railway station. Men went one way, women the other way. I mean, we're all going to Germany, but different places. Now, I know now that the men were sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. And we ended up, I was with the women, and we ended up in Ravensbrück concentration camp. And that was after a very long journey of 4.5 days without food or water or sanitary provisions.
And that was in a cattle train, am I correct?
In a cattle truck, yes,
Horrible. Very
crowded. People were dying, and the dead and the living had to just be there together all that time. It was a terrible journey. But when we finally arrived, we found ourselves in Ravensbrück concentration camp. Now, the first thing they did in Ravensbrück was take everything away from us. We brought very little, but whatever it was they took. We had to queue up and give our details because, as you know, Germans were very meticulous about record keeping. Then we had to undress, our clothing was taken away. We went through cold communal showers. And when we got out at the other end, we got the concentration camp garb with the striped jacket and the skirt and sort of wooden-soled shoes. And when we looked at one another, we just could not recognize one another with the shaved heads. We just looked all exactly the same. And that has a terrible effect on one. I mean, to be stripped of one's identity is something that's difficult to describe. Because, you know, I often, when I speak to younger people, I sort of point out what it is to be an individual. And suddenly you're just like everybody else. And it just does something to your soul. By then, we had been going through the Holocaust for 5 years. And we had lost everything. We had lost family, we had lost our possessions. We were really at the end of, we felt our lives, certainly at the end of our tether. But this time, you know, on this occasion, we felt the effect it had on us is to make us lose hope. And without hope, there's no survival. And it showed itself very quickly in the way people started dying. My aunt, one of my aunts who was on this, I had 2 aunts on that transport, well, one of them, Franja Klein, died within a very short time of arrival. My best friend, Pema Blachman, died soon afterwards. People were just giving up. And our rations were half a slice of black bread, something called soup, which was a grey liquid, and something called coffee, which was a brown liquid. Occasionally we got a knob of margarine. But somehow we continued. We didn't have much. Some people worked, I didn't. And we weren't there all that long when they decided to deport us again. And this time, after a shorter journey, we found ourselves in Bergen Belsen. Now, when we arrived there, we got off the train, were greeted in the usual charming way of the German soldiers with their rifles, with shouting Raus, without the big doors open, the sort of clanking of the doors, and Raus, and we had to jump down from quite a high platform, and we walked to the camp. And there they had no room for us, because that was towards the end of the war, and not that we knew it. And we were, and they were sending people from the German, the German, actually the German camps in Poland to actually the German camps in Germany. And all the German camps were getting very overcrowded, but Bergen Belsen was terribly overcrowded, and they had no room for us, so they put us up in a tent overnight on bare ground. This enormous tent with hundreds and hundreds of people. And next day, they actually let us into the camp. And what we saw defies description. It was like something out of hell. The first thing that struck you was the sort of smog and smell. And there were people there, but they were like skeletons. And they were shuffling along aimlessly. And they would shuffle along, just collapse and die. And there were dead bodies everywhere. And there were piles of bodies, there were individual bodies, there were piles of naked, twisted, decaying corpses. It was a horrific sight, and there was terrible overcrowding. So when we got to our barracks, of course, there was very little room, but I heard somewhere along the way that there is a children's barracks somewhere in the camp. I quickly set out to find it with my little cousin Anne. And we were interviewed by two women, a Dr. Bimko and Dr. Bimko and her sister Luba. Now, they asked us a lot of questions, and at the end of it all, they said to me that we are also very overcrowded, but in any case, you are too old, she said to me, Sister Luba said to me. And at that time I was 14, I had reached 14. And I said, okay, I understand, will you take my cousin? And they said yes, but there's no way Anne was going to stay without me. She was absolutely terrified to leave me. And she really meant it. She wasn't going to stay, and they could see. I said, well, you better tell her, but nothing would help. And in the end, they relented and took me in as well. So I was really lucky that, I could say she saved my life, and well, earlier I saved her life, and so on. So it was actually a children's home. We called it a children's home, very respectable, but it was actually a big shed, a barracks for, full of children. And the children, they were actually Dutch. They had been separated from their parents. They had an amazing story, which I don't have time to tell you. But they were a very interesting bunch of children, some of them very young, some only a few months old. And the eldest one was just about my age. She was slightly older, but because she had two younger brothers there, and she came to see them every day, and then they said, you better stay, you're always here anyway. And so I was in that place with children. It was only marginally better there, because by then Belsen was really running out of all food, and there was chaos, really.
Mala, can you tell us what happened when you ended up having typhoid, and what happened to Anna then?
Well, I did. She also fell ill, not that I even knew it, because by then we were sort of being cared for a little bit, so I wasn't sort of directing every move of hers, but she also succumbed to typhus, as did I. And I remember lying on my upper bunk by the window. I must have come back into consciousness when I saw people running. And didn't know why they were running or where they were running, but all I could think of was how did they have the strength to run? And that was the 15th of April, 1945. When we were liberated by the British, by the amazing British.
Absolutely. And what was it like to be liberated by the British when they arrived on the 15th of April 1945 and liberated Bergen Belsen?
Yes, well, a lot of us were ill. I was one of those people that were ill. And I was transferred to a hospital. And all around me, well, there was nothing but kindness after all the horrors and all the terrible things we had been going through. Suddenly, we're being treated like people. We were suddenly cared for. And it was quite amazing. But it wasn't, for instance, like it was in England when the war finished and people were dancing in the street, because we had terrible problems to overcome after the war. For a lot of people, it was a real dilemma where to go, who survived, well, what we're going to do. But I was in this lucky position at my age where I didn't make any decisions. Things were decided for me. And for instance, once I recovered from typhus, together with my cousin and other children, we were sent to Sweden in July. And I still didn't know who had survived and who hadn't. But eventually Ben and I found one another, and then again it was decided for me to come to England to be reunited with Ben. So that was another decision that was outside, you know, out of my hands. And I was just lucky that the decisions made for me were always good. And well, what can I say? I was just simply lucky.
And can you tell us something about your friendship with Anne? Because you saved her life, didn't you, by looking after her and protecting her
yes.
for all those years, you know, in Ravensbrück and also in Bergen Belsen. Can you tell us something about your friendship with Anne?
It was amazing because she was so attached to me during the war. She was terrified of losing me. Once the war was finished, when we arrived in Sweden, they wouldn't have put a 7-year-old with a 14-year-old in the same. We were sort of in like boarding school, but all children, you know, for the camps. And she suddenly shed that fear. It was like a miracle. She didn't mind being separated from me. So she was with another group of children, first in the same building, then in a different building, then in a different town. And even now, when I look back at some photographs, you can see that she looks sort of content and relaxed, and she's not scared. I think this war had such a terrible effect on her. So we were separated, and her mother survived. So I came to England. She was still in Sweden then, but she soon was found by her mother, and they were reunited. They ended up in Australia, where Anne had a happy life. Her mother remarried because her father was killed during the war. And she had a wonderful stepfather. He was really wonderful to her. And she got married, she had children, and she had a good life, but unfortunately she died some years ago because she developed a medical condition that incapacitated her to an extent where she couldn't do anything for herself. But we were in touch, and we saw one another during that post-war period.
Amazing. And can you tell us what it was like when you received that letter from your brother, Ben, to know that he was actually alive and he actually found you?
Well, I can tell you the immediate, by the time I received the letter, I knew that he was alive. The letter came after I knew it. The letter wasn't telling me that he survived. And I remember picking up that letter. I remember where I was at the time, and that was this boarding school with big grounds. And I remember reading the letter, and I was so happy, deliriously happy. I ran out of the building and through the grounds where sort of people milling around and talking. And I said, oh, my brother survived. I got a letter from my brother. And that's all I remember. But obviously it was a very emotional sort of feeling. It is difficult to describe what I felt, but it was only happiness, really.
Fantastic. And you've received MBE from the Queen.
Yes.
When did you start telling your compelling but also horrific story?
It was a very gradual process. There were always people interested, but not many. There was the odd club or the odd school or maybe synagogue, church. But now that it is on the curriculum, you know, there's a great demand for survivors. And unfortunately, the demand came sort of rather late in the day, but those that can still do it. And I have to say that I always get a very warm reception, and these young people that I speak to, they really want to know, they really care about what happened. And that's very heartwarming to know that people care, and the caring is not about me actually, about all those victims who are not here to speak for themselves. So it serves a purpose apart from educating them. Well, hopefully that the victims won't be forgotten.
No, they won't be. And Mala, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. I want to thank you for your courage. I want to thank you for your bravery and your willingness to share your compelling and powerful story about how you triumphed over the evil of Nazism, and that you're here today to tell the story. What would you say to young people about the rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing here today, and to understand the horrors that took place over 70 years ago by the Nazis? In 30
yeah,
seconds.
very quickly, I'll just say don't stand by, don't be a bystander. Do something about it. Take action and don't tolerate discrimination and prejudice and all these things that lead to what we have seen in the Second World War, like the Holocaust. Don't let it happen again by really protesting and doing something about it.
Mala, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on the programme today. Thank you so much for sharing your remarkable story. I'm personally very touched and moved by your story, and I'm sure that our viewers watching today's interview will be really touched. And we want to say that we just want to give you our love and support by saying as a channel and this programme that we're standing by the Jewish people, we're standing by the Jewish nation that is the nation of Israel, and that together we'll fight against this evil that is anti-Semitism. So thank you for having the courage and the standing to be here today.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you all for watching this very special edition of the Middle East Report, as you've heard Mala's powerful and compelling story of how she overcame the evil that was Nazism, and that she survived the horrors of the Holocaust and is here today to tell a powerful and remarkable story. It's a lesson that we all must learn, that we must stand against the rise of evil and against the rise of anti-Semitism. So thank you for watching today's special Middle East Report.